At first despised, later much admired, submarines have polarized opinion ever since their creation. Nazi propaganda hailed them as wonder weapons, and they continue to bask in a myth of invincibility.
Submarines today are big business and are spreading in terms of sophistication and numbers across the face of the planet.
Submarines are extremely sophisticated machines, brimming with technology and weaponry. The complexity of their construction is as impressive as their power to destroy. Innovation and captivation, danger and destruction, the two faces of submarines. A submarine provides a secure space. It can be used in reconnaissance, but can also act as a deterrent, as well as destroy whole swathes of land. Its stealth is its greatest attribute. It dives into the darkness of the sea, lurking insidiously, silent and unseen. It's no coincidence that the German submarines in the Second World War were given the nickname Grey Wolves.
Of course, the term grey wolf was a pure piece of propaganda. The grey part may well have had to do with the colour of the submarines, but was also a metaphor for their invisibility, like the proverbial greyness being inconspicuous, invisible, and the wolf symbolises aggression.
From 1940 onwards, the Grey Wolves demonstrated their strength in the Battle of the Atlantic. German advances in the West led to increased naval confrontations against the British. The German Navy targeted British supply routes. Submarines were given the task of blocking Allied trade across the Atlantic. To do this, they developed a new strategy, the so-called wolf pack tactic.
The submarine which first scouted the convoy didn't strike straight away, but ciphered messages to bring in other submarines. Once together in a wolf pack, as it were, the subs attacked. British convoys were poorly protected at first and were not prepared to handle such attacks, which usually occurred at night above water and remained undetected. The Germans enjoyed considerable success.
So at an instant, the German submarine force was able to wipe away the advantage that the British thought they had, and that gave them some of their most effective attacks on the convoys.
Once again, Nazi propaganda stylized U-boats as a wonder weapon.
Heimkehr von siegreicher Feindfahrt. Das Unterseeboot läuft in seinen Heimathafen ein.
Their victories were glorified. The commanders became the face of their submarine success.
Wartime propaganda anywhere is always about motivating the population at home, giving them role models and heroes for the young to emulate. How's that done? Just take any submariner. They were all young and good-looking. They were kind of carefree, not the barracks type. Casual jackets, skewed caps. They were the ideal protagonists to serve the Third Reich's propaganda machine.
There was a kind of fascination with heroes and the courage of these men who were all very young. They fought for their country's triumph without any political motivation, and they did it under difficult circumstances, in a realm that was still very unknown and left plenty of room for the imagination.
Qui était mal connu et qui laisse beaucoup de fantasmes.
The first submarine hero to become famous in the Second World War was Captain Lieutenant Gunther Prien. On the night of the 14th of October 1939, Prien pulled off a masterstroke. With his U-47 boat, he penetrated the tightly guarded British naval base of Scapa Flow and sank the anchored battleship Royal Oak.
It was a daring exploit because the U-boat literally went into the lion's den, a strongly defended naval base chosen as a natural harbour with only narrow points of entry covered by anti-submarine nets.
Nazi propaganda made a mountain out of the attack and exploited it to the full. Gunther Prien was a publicity gift, a national hero for the people.
Der Eindruck war unermesslich. Und als wir draußen waren, können Sie sich vorstellen, welche Begeisterung und Freude uns alle beseelte, dass es uns gelungen war, eine solche Aufgabe und einen solchen Erfolg für Deutschland erringen zu können.
So the Nazis had their hero, a picture book boy. Not all that different from today's boy groups or football stars. Every kid knew these guys. There were stamps with their faces on them. You could collect them. And their accomplishments could easily be measured. You could count how many ships they sank. The results of their military achievement were tangible. People could relate to it. It was easy to understand. Even kids got it.
The desired effect hoped for by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and those in power around him came to fruition. More and more volunteers signed up for the Navy.
Auf seine Frage, was willst du einmal werden, kommt prompt die Antwort: U-Boot-Fahrer, Herr Großadmiral. Und ihr? Einstimmig: U-Boot-Fahrer, Herr Großadmiral.
A young Gerhard Rinkowski was also keen to join the Navy. More than half a century later, the former submariner still recalls his time on board vividly. At the ripe age of 17, Rinkowski dropped his apprenticeship to join the Navy in July 1942.
So, Meister,
I said to my boss, it's war. I'll probably be drafted anyway. What's the point of waiting? If I have to fight, then at least I want to see a bit of the world. That's why I decided to go to sea. I read a lot of books under the covers at night when I was a little boy.
The young men were looking for adventure. Innocent and unsuspecting, they began their training in the Navy, blinded by propaganda.
The submarine school was so strict, you even learned how to eat with a knife and fork. You could say we were Germany's diplomats in overseas service. So they taught us etiquette. We thought it was great.
It was a step up on the social ladder. The contingent was very small. Everybody knew each other. The officers were friends. It was nothing like the scale of the army. Only people who had no skills joined the infantry. The special ones, the elite, went to the submarine corps.
In May 1943, U-boat 313 set sail in the North Sea. No one on board knew about the imminent danger.
40 boats had been destroyed in a single month. There were 67 boats in action in the Mediterranean. 60 never came back. There were at least 50 men on each boat. Of course, no one told us about this.
After stepping on board, the stoker soon realized that reality had nothing to do with the image conveyed by propaganda. The men ate, slept and worked together at breaking point in a cramped 50-meter-long steel tube.
We were permanently exhausted. Half the technical staff were on watch, while the other half rested. The blankets were always warm because we just swapped sheets and pillows. We never changed, but were constantly on deck in our underwear, knitwear, long stockings and warm jumpers. It was often damp and wet for weeks.
Es war oft feucht, nass und das wochenlang.
Die Wäsche stank.
Our clothes stank. There was practically no way of drying the damp clothes. You couldn't take a shower because the water supply was limited.
Sie konnten wegen des eingeschränkten Wasservorrates nicht duschen.
Hygiene was poor, especially on long missions. There was only one toilet. German subs were smaller and narrower than British or American ones, so hygiene was even worse. They were extreme conditions. Ultimately, only young people could stand it.
Once deployed to war, submarine crews were mercilessly confronted with the perils beyond the myth.
An English destroyer was behind us. We dived. We fired a torpedo. It took 9 minutes. And then there was a terrible noise. We'd hit a destroyer. Your mind started racing because you knew it could be your turn in just a minute or two. If they'd fired their torpedoes, they'd have hit us from behind. It was awful. Such madness. Then we went back to the spot where we'd sunk it, and there was all this debris floating around, but not a single man that could be saved. They were all gone.
What is a human life worth? The submarine war went beyond the waters of the Atlantic. A catastrophe was brewing in the Pacific Ocean too. On the 7th of December 1941, Imperial Japanese Navy planes attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in a surprise raid. About an hour prior to the attack, an American destroyer was said to have torpedoed a Japanese submarine, effectively firing the first shots in the Pacific War between the two countries. More than 2,000 people died in the bombing of Pearl Harbor. A few days after the devastating attack, the USA entered the war. The American submarine fleet was the first contingent to launch a counterattack. The Japanese had already destroyed a large part of the American Pacific Fleet in order to secure the supply route of raw materials from Southeast Asia. US submarines began to target these routes with the aim of stopping the enemy's plundering of its overseas conquests. At the outbreak of war, the Americans possessed the largest submarine force in the Pacific. Their vessels were large, relatively fast, and provided greater comfort for the crew, a decisive advantage on week-long patrols in the vast area conquered by the Japanese. The US strategy proved a success. Submarines disrupted Japanese shipping supplies, playing the decisive role in causing the collapse of the Japanese economy. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy also shared a single objective: to disrupt enemy trade and sink enemy ships. Both sides' strategies in attacking the enemy were entirely dependent on bug-proof secure radio communication.
The encryption of radio traffic is a key operational aspect for all submarines. Without it, the submarines would effectively be operating blindly, looking for a needle in a haystack. Radio is the key to effective navigation and the use of this weapon system.
Macht dieses Waffensystem eigentlich Sinn und kann effektiv eingesetzt werden.
They had a superb means of encrypting their messages, which the Allies could not hope to rival. We call it Enigma. It was a machine that had millions of variations that could encrypt a signal.
In Stuttgart, engineer Klaus Kopacz is the proud owner of a rare original Enigma encryption machine that still works perfectly. Its mechanics are simple. Its effect on radio traffic at the time was groundbreaking.
Das ist eine Drei-Walzen-Enigma.
This is a three-key Enigma, which dates to 1936. It was used by the Army, the Air Force, and in a similar way by the Navy until 1942. The keyboard is made up entirely of letters, no numbers. If you press a letter, in this case J, then C lights up here. If you type J again, then another letter lights up, because the rotors inside the machine keep turning every time you press a key, effectively like a speedometer. The coding of letters into numbers thereby varies with every keystroke.
The three rotors are arranged on a spindle so that they can rotate independently of each other. In addition, the plug board enabled variable wiring and thereby contributed more cryptographic strength.
This plug board is a distinctive component of the machine, used exclusively by the military, both the Army, the Air Force and the Navy. It was not available to private companies and was always under heavy guard when it was transported. The plug board worked in both directions, connecting letters in pairs as the signal entered and when it left the rotors. Not patching the cords meant the combination of settings was infinitesimally smaller compared to the settings enabled by the 10 pairs of letters when the plug board was wired. This is what made decoding the machine so difficult. And that was the main challenge, to understand how these plug connections really worked.
The British did everything in their power to get their hands on one of these machines, initially in vain. But then, in May 1941, the U-110 boat under the command of Fritz Julius Lemp was spotted by the enemy and attacked with depth charges, forcing the submarine to surface. Lemp ordered the crew to abandon ship.
As Fritz Julius Lemp swam around in the sea, having abandoned U-110 with his crew, he realised that he made a dreadful error. He knew that they hadn't actually destroyed the Enigma machine or the code books, and if it didn't sink, then the Allies would get this amazing gift.
The British had struck gold and immediately took the secret documents to Bletchley Park, an hour's drive from London. The country's best cryptanalysts gathered there to begin to decipher the Germans' coded radio traffic. At the forefront of the decryption was British mathematician Alan Turing. His electromechanical Turing bomb succeeded in breaking the Enigma codes. The Polish mathematicians Marin Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki and Henryk Cegalski also made major contributions in the preliminary work, a breakthrough for the Royal Navy.
So the Allies were able to reroute convoys away from the U-boats. They also were able to anticipate what Dönitz was about to do. And when U-boats sent back tonnage reports, how many ships they'd sunk and how many torpedoes they'd expended, the Allies were also able to understand the status of submarines and how well they'd fared.
By introducing improved radar systems and expanding their air traffic surveillance, the Allies were able to upgrade their technology. Casualties on the German side began to increase. The myth of the invisible submarine began to crumble.
The Allies are sinking them faster than the Nazis can build them.
This was the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Soon the hunters became the hunted. One boat in particular helped shape the myths surrounding submarines. The U-96, the submarine at the centre of Lothar Gunther Buchheim's best-selling novel and internationally successful film adaptation, Das Boot. In 1941, the U-96 was passing through the Strait of Gibraltar on its way from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. One of the men on board was 25-year-old chief engineer Friedrich Grader.
We weren't in the Navy to kill time. We wanted to wipe out the enemy. That was our job. And the more we could do, the better.
Je mehr wir dazu beitragen konnten, umso besser.
War correspondent Lothar Gunther Buchheim also joined the U-boat's 7th patrol.
Buchheim
was a hard worker, an overachiever. He worked for the German propaganda unit, the PK. He was there to take pictures and make a report. He loved photography. It was his greatest passion. He had several cameras on board, a Contax, a Leica, and some other. He was very focused on his work.
Buchheim chose not to portray victorious heroes in his pictures, but to capture the look on exhausted men's faces as they passed the time monotonously, terrified of dying. His camera gave a unique insight into the lives of submariners behind the myth, warts and all. The strains of their confinement, constantly under pressure, is written in the men's faces. In December 1941, the U-boat was just about to enter the Strait of Gibraltar.
Below deck, we heard that there was an air raid warning, and then everything collapsed around us. The bridge crew fell through the tube hatch and the central hatch. And while people were still scrambling to safety, the first bomb struck. The boat was pushed underwater. The commander tried to maneuver away from the patrol planes and succeeded. So we were able to start surfacing. And we could see what was going on above water. If the coast was clear, we needed to surface to check the damage and make repairs, as well as get some air. It didn't take long, which was good, because we didn't have much time. Another plane came along, and we had to dive again, without being able to complete the repairs. There was a lot of damage. Unfortunately, the boat got so heavy during the crash dive that we could hardly control it. The tailplane rudders weren't strong enough. The boat was top-heavy. There was nothing I could do.
Das Boot war stark vorlastig und ich kriegte das Boot nicht mehr in den Griff.
The U-96's uncontrolled descent became a key scene in Wolfgang Petersen's film. The men's faces are panic-stricken as they fear for their lives. No one knows if the U-boat will be able to withstand the growing pressure as the boat continues to sink. Buchheim's historic photos, on the other hand, capture the men's tense concentration. So how authentic is Wolfgang Petersen's film?
The film Das Boot has naturally shaped popular conceptions of submarining. It's a very realistic film in its dramatic structure and condensed portrayal. One could say it shows submarining how it was, and to some extent, how it still is today.
I liked the film a lot. It's fiction, not a documentary. It did a good job of portraying the mood on the boat and explaining things.
The sense of confinement, tight spaces, the fear, the noise, the smell. You can literally smell the stench and sweat and the fear. The men were all terrified of drowning. I think the film was able to convey that well and bring the submarine war to the attention of a wider audience who might not have known about the role it played in the Second World War.
In the south of Munich, on a lot in the Bavaria Film Studios, are the models used to shoot the 1981 film. At 55 meters, the set for the U-96 was only slightly longer than the real submarine.
The set was built on this gigantic seesaw, which could turn 40 degrees in any direction within 6 seconds, making it incredibly mobile. It could imitate any physical movement made by a submarine perfectly. The actors never knew which direction it was taking, whether it would move or not. This seesaw effect was crucial to ensuring the authenticity of the film.
This authenticity was mainly due to its detail-obsessed director, Wolfgang Petersen, who not only did everything in his power to put the actors into the Submariners situation, but also made sure that the reproduction of the U-boat was as accurate as possible.
The set we are standing in here today is a one-to-one replica of a Second World War type 7C submarine. There is one surviving original in Laboe. Rolf Zebauer, the film architect, visited it and photographed everything, but this model is no longer in the state it was in 1941. They took the original plans and rebuilt this boat one-to-one in its original size.
The set of Das Boot has been the crowd puller at the Bavaria Film Studios for years. Millions of visitors want to dive into this shadowy submarine world.
It's a weird thing about human beings in that they seem to like things that are a bit mysterious, a bit deadly, and possibly, if you get aboard them, could kill you. It's the sort of risk, it's the thrill of a risk. That's part of the charisma, if you like, a submarine.
As the Second World War neared its inevitable end, the once victorious U-boats were more like coffins leading their crews to their death. Grand Admiral Dönitz still believed he could turn the tide in Germany's favour. He initiated the construction of a new, more modern submarine. What remains of his endeavour is the largest freestanding bunker in Nazi Germany, built directly on the River Weser in Bremen-Fager over an area of more than 35,000 square metres. Its codename, Valentin.
The Valentin bunker was built between May 1943 and March 1945 in just under 22 months and was the second largest above-ground bunker in Europe and the largest project instigated by the German Navy in the last 2 years of the war. It was meant to be a bunkered submarine shipyard with a protected assembly line for mass production.
Thousands of forced labourers were coerced into building this monstrous structure under inhumane conditions. More than 1,600 of them lost their lives in the process.
The idea was to work on 12 boats at the same time, using 12 rotating stations. In the first phase, they wanted to discharge a boat every 56 hours. Then, once standard operation had been achieved, every 48 hours. The aim was to achieve a speed of construction that would have been impossible under normal procedure in normal shipyards, especially as these shipyards were being attacked constantly.
But the Valentin bunker was also heavily bombed during its construction. The new Type 21 submarines came too late. The Germans had already lost the war. By the end of the war, the numbers revealed the harsh reality faced by submariners. Only a quarter of the men survived. More than 30,000 died. No other weapon saw such high casualties. Gerhard Rinkowski survived, but his U-boat, like about 150 others, fell into Allied hands. For months, the German submarines were lined up in berths in Londonderry, off the coast of Northern Ireland.
There were 5 of us on board. They towed us out and a launch came to pick us up. And that's when we realized they were going to sink the submarine.
After the men disembarked, their submarines were sunk in the open sea. In what is known as Operation Deadlight, the British destroyed a total of 115 submarines.
I imagine that was an emotional moment for the submariners who had been on those boats for such a long time and even survived them. It must have been something watching their boats being sunk by the enemy. It was a symbolic act in a collective effort to win the war against the submarine.
There was no way, in reality, once the Allies cottoned on to what their weaknesses were and solved them, that the U-boat force would win. It just wasn't going to happen. And although they tried very hard, unfortunately, it was all for nothing.
While Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, Japan seemed intent on fighting to the last man. Suicidal kamikaze planes attacked the advancing American troops and their allies. War raged on both land and at sea, claiming millions of lives on both sides, with no end in sight. At the end of July, the Japanese Prime Minister rejected an ultimatum to surrender. After obtaining approval from President Truman, the US military carried out the most devastating nuclear attack in history, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and destroying the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. It was the beginning of the atomic age, bringing with it new and alarming possibilities for submarines. Nuclear propulsion allowed almost unlimited diving time, and atomic power provided a completely new weapon system with ballistic missiles.
During the Cold War, the most dangerous front, in reality, was at sea. Nuclear power was the game changer for advantage under the ocean during the Cold War, and remains the same today.
In the Cold War, submarines played a role primarily as carriers of strategic nuclear weapons. Of course, there were conventional submarines too, but this was the new dimension we'd moved into.
The USA paved the way. On the 21st of January 1954, the Americans made a major breakthrough by launching the world's first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus. With a length of almost 100 meters, it was home to a crew of 105 people, a technical revolution designed by its creator, Hyman Rickover. These New Age submarines were powered by a nuclear reactor on board, mostly located at the rear of the boat. The splitting of the atom generates enormous heat, which drives the turbines. The reactor provides energy in abundance and thus ensures sufficient oxygen, electricity and fresh water. There is no limit to the time the boat can stay underwater. In making the first ever underwater crossing of the North Pole in the summer of 1958, the USS Nautilus proved the advantages of its modern propulsion system. Not just a world record, but also a demonstration of power during the Cold War.
With nuclear power, you could go under the ice, you could stay down as long as you liked, you could power any sensors, any intelligence gathering equipment you liked, and also weaponry, and stay hidden from the moment you left port, almost, until when you returned, and nobody would know where you were.
With the Nautilus, the Americans had a submarine they could send anywhere in the world's oceans, right up to the enemy's front door. That was a threat that didn't exist before.
It was the beginning of the nuclear arms race. 4 years after the Nautilus's maiden voyage, the Russians launched the Leninsky Komsomol, their nuclear response. To catch up in numbers, the Soviets were forced to cut corners in testing, resulting in a second generation of nuclear submarines, which followed soon after. The nuclear superpower, the USA, followed suit and built the USS George Washington, the first operational ballistic missile submarine. The two blocks watched each other's every military step, always ready to answer a potential first strike.
This revolutionized the entire technology, making submarines a key weapon in the Cold War because they were so difficult to detect. They ensured the superpower's second strike capability.
Und damit die Zweitschlagfähigkeit der Supermächte gewährleisten.
Im Prinzip eine gegenseitige
It was basically a mutual life insurance. You can't destroy me without me being able to destroy you afterwards.
Auch noch vernichten kann.
In the early 1960s, the French began building their own ballistic missile submarine, the Navy's first nuclear submarine. The Redoutable was a demonstration of the French policy of nuclear deterrence.
Deterrence is about making a potential adversary understand what's at stake. He may hurt you, but you have a response that will hit him at least as hard. That's the nature of nuclear deterrence.
Today, the once feared Titan resides in a museum in the French port of Cherbourg on the coast of Normandy. 128 meters in length, the Redoutable is the largest public museum submarine in the world. Admiral François Dupont was a submarine commander on a later nuclear model for more than 20 years. These boats have been ploughing the world's oceans non-stop since the 1990s. Their mission is as simple as it is complex. They have to be ready for a nuclear second strike. Their stealth is their most important weapon. As commander, Dupont led a crew of 110 men. A mission would involve spending 70 days underwater. On board, torpedoes and 16 medium-range ballistic missiles.
C'est ce qui est compliqué sur le sous-marin, c'est-à-dire qu'il faut vivre.
That's what makes a nuclear submarine complicated. You live right next to an atomic bomb and a nuclear reactor.
Qui sont là et qui doivent vivre avec.
The men have to handle this for 70 days at a time. There can be no mistakes. If you do fire a missile, it had better work. The slightest defect can be fatal.
Et en étant sûr qu'il n'y ait pas d'interférence qui fasse des risques trop gros.
At a depth of 300 meters, the submarine was cloaked in complete darkness, with no day or night. To give the crew a sense of time, the lighting changed from red at night to white during the day. Navigating in complete darkness meant that ambient sounds were crucial. As commander of a nuclear submarine, François Dupont was also dependent on precise analysis.
A
submarine is not just a long tube which can hold out the water pressure. It's also a gigantic ear. The analysts, or so-called golden ears, are people who have a special musical ear and particularly good hearing. They can distinguish the sound of an aircraft carrier from a submarine or cargo ship.
D'un sous-marin, d'un cargo, etc., etc.
The submarine's interiors were nothing like those of the First and Second World Wars. Leather chairs and silverware for the officers, separate sleeping quarters for 12 people each. Only the personal sacrifice has remained the same.
C'est pas très facile d'être coupé de sa famille. Il faut avoir une très grande confiance à la fois dans sa femme.
It's not easy to be separated from your family. You have to have great faith in your wife to look after the children. Normally, it's something you both do.
Chaque dimanche après-midi.
Every Sunday afternoon, I took some time off to look at photo albums and have a sense of intimacy and closeness, although I was thousands of miles from home.
C'est agréable à retrouver comme ça à des milliers de kilomètres de distance.
The boat's canteen provided a forum for the men to share their thoughts. No one finds it easy being cut off from the outside world.
We know no one will tell us if our kids get sick or if our wife is ill. That gets us down.
But their fascination is stronger. For François Dupont as well.
J'ai adoré les 25 ans que j'ai passé à bord de ce sous-marin.
I loved the 25 years I spent on that submarine.
Ambiance d'équipage, une façon de vivre.
The mood amongst the crew was special. Everyone took on responsibility.
Chacun a sa place, chacun a sa responsabilité.
Everyone had their place and a certain authority. It always fulfilled me as a person.
Comblé en termes humains.
Submariners stick together. It's like a brotherhood. I still have contact with my crew today, 32 years after my first command. We meet up every year.
The camaraderie between men is a central part of the submarine myth. In literature and film, submariners are ideal characters onto whom readers and audiences can project their imagination. Men who fight in secret, whether in the Battle of the Atlantic or later in the Cold War. A group of men sharing a common fate in a triangle of war, fear and death.
It was a fascination for heroes, a fascination that's remained. The concept of a submarine, this underwater tube, with all these men trapped together, all sharing the same fate. Whether commander or the humblest submariner. If the submarine sinks, everyone goes down. It's a world in itself.
Following the end of the Cold War, the number of strategic submarines decreased in both the US and Russia. However, while the US Navy maintained a stable deployment frequency per boat, the Russian Navy was barely able to finance running operations. Rusting boats in Murmansk harbour came to symbolize the dilapidated state of the Russian fleet. The potential danger of a submarine was once again critically demonstrated in 2000. On the 12th of August, the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk, the star of the Russian North Sea Fleet, was on a summer exercise in the Barents Sea. Shortly after it dived to fire a test torpedo, there was a huge explosion.
One of the torpedoes exploded, probably due to some unknown fuel, and the entire forward section of the boat was completely destroyed. The boat sank straight away and settled on the seabed at around 110 meters deep. Most of the sailors died instantly, but about 24 men at the back of the stern survived the initial explosion and flooding.
23 men were trapped in the sunken boat. One of them was Dmitry Kolesnikov. He was an officer in the Russian Navy. Before the tragedy, he proudly showed his wife Olga his boat, recording her visit on video.
Look here. If I turn this wheel, the ship goes to the left. If I turn the other way, it goes to the right. It's as simple as that.
Olga recalls her husband's pride at being a submarine officer.
I wouldn't say his love for the submarine was bigger than his love for me, but for Mitya, I would say it was on a par. We were both equally important to him.
Only 6 weeks after filming his video, the young officer was trapped at the bottom of the sea in the sunken Kursk. Russian rescue teams tried to recover the crew. They said they heard knocking. Unfortunately, the military turned down offers of international assistance. The Russians wanted to deal with the problem themselves, with Russian mini-submarines that were completely outdated.
At the time, the Russians had no money to pay their crews. They had to save on training and missions. It was irresponsible to allow a submarine with such an insufficiently trained crew launch a weapon of such complexity. And the rescue mission also betrayed the fact that the Russian Navy was way out of its depth.
Mit dem Umgang dieser Notsituation absolut überfordert war.
8 days after disaster had struck, the Russian military finally decided to accept foreign help. Divers from the Norwegian salvage ship Seaway Eagle took on the task of diving down to the ill-fated boat and trying to open the escape hatch.
Suddenly it was clear. He's not alive. It was an awful thought. Officially, there was no clarification, but I knew he was dead. I'd lost all faith.
When the divers finally managed to open the hatch, Olga's fear became a sad reality. No one had survived.
I remember it vividly. It was a dramatic moment for everybody. There's a close bond between submariners, including the Russians. We'd kept track of things closely, and we were all shocked to see that it wasn't possible to save those 23 people in the end.
It's the scenario that every submariner runs through their mind. You think, how could something like this happen? What caused it? You imagine yourself in the role of the sailors who've gone through it.
118 people lost their lives on the Kursk, trapped in a steel coffin. A human tragedy and an indictment of the Russian armed forces.
To lose their submarine right on their own doorstep through an explosion caused by one of their own torpedoes, and then not to be able to carry out the salvage operation to rescue the survivors. In the end, it was incompetence and a lack of modern equipment that led to their deaths. That was a low point, ruining their reputation. They blew it on a world stage.
It took Russian President Vladimir Putin a further 2 weeks to speak to the angered and bereaved families. He refused to accept any responsibility for the fatal rescue mission. It was only possible to identify one of the submariners during the salvage operation, Dmitry Kolesnikov. In his pocket was a farewell letter to his wife, Olga, written in the last hours before his death.
It's pitch dark. I'm writing blindly. We don't stand a chance.
The Kursk disaster didn't result in the dismantling of Russian submarines. On the contrary, the submarine is very much part of the Russian military concept today.
The fact that even a major submarine accident like the Kursk did nothing to change the status of submarines in the Russian military is tied to the fact that there is no real military alternative. Submarines continue to play a key role in military strategy making and the capability profile of navies and fleets around the world.
Submarines today are big business and are spreading in terms of sophistication and numbers across the face of the planet. And on top of that, a submarine is now able to reach 1,000 miles inland. If you're talking about cruise missiles fired by the Royal Navy or the US Navy or the Russian Navy or the French, cruise missiles give a Navy 1,000-mile reach potentially. And that means that they can sit off the shore of a hostile nation and fire those weapons deep inland.
Submarines are a demonstration of strength, especially in times of increasing geopolitical change. Countries such as America, China and France are reinforcing their military significance by building new boats worth billions. Russian President Vladimir Putin is leading the way. He recently presented the Belgorod, the world's largest nuclear submarine. The Belgorod is 178 meters long. Compared to the submarines of the Second World War, this Russian nuclear submarine is a giant. Even the first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, was considerably smaller. The Russian Navy has created a monster twice the length of a large Boeing. Billed as a floating science platform, the truth is the Russians have made a destroyer. Its greatest threat is not its size.
The reason the Belgorod exists is to carry a new nuclear-tipped drone, which is called a torpedo. In fact, it's a massive drone, 72 feet long, with a 100 megaton warhead on it, called the Poseidon, that can be fired by the Belgorod and then race at high speed across the Atlantic to hit New York or some other port and detonate and cause nuclear devastation.
This is important to me because the whole point of nuclear deterrence is that no missile should ever be detonated. If a missile explodes or if we do use nuclear power as a weapon on the battlefield, then we're breaking a taboo, the taboo of direct conflict. If that happens, we'll come to the point where we don't know where it will all end.
The submarine is a technical marvel, even if today's underwater vessels have nothing in common with Jules Verne's Nautilus. They are no longer narrow steel tubes, which the crew is squeezed into, but ultra-modern diving stations reaching record depths. For mankind, the submarine has always been both a shelter and a deadly leviathan. As conventional submarines, they assist in reconnaissance missions. As nuclear submarines, they pose an ever-present threat, and they have become a global business worth billions.
Submarines have gone from being what were regarded as ineffectual toys by the battleship admirals and others to being these immensely powerful beasts that are incredibly complex and now carry enough power, potentially, to destroy the whole planet out there under the surface of the sea all the time.
There will always be two faces to the submarine, both captivating and terrifying, to this day onwards.